as we wait for people to come in to the room, I thought we'd just start going over the background, introducing ourselves, because most people attending will already know this information. So we can get going and people will join in their own time. This is the fourth and final CAUSINDY online webinar. We're really excited to be talking about gender, but not only gender in terms of equality and empowerment, which are concepts that most of us are familiar with. We're talking about gender from an intersectional perspective. And so we have Dr. Annisa, Dr. Dina Afrianty, and Beau Newham joining us today. I'll be moderating tonight's panel from Jaja Wurrung Land, and I want to pay respects to Aboriginal people past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And I'm sure our panelists can introduce themselves and where they're speaking from tonight. We will be talking about gender advocacy, equality and empowerment from a range of intersectional perspectives, including disability, queer advocacy and decolonization. And if you have any questions about these terms, our panelists will define them before we begin. But if you have any questions and you're not quite sure what any of these terms mean, please just let us know in the comment session. I know myself, I've been working on gender and gendered violence for 4 years now, and sometimes you take things for granted. You think, I know what this means. And so if we're talking about something and you think, no, I'm not quite sure what that means, then please do ask, because we want everyone to be included in the conversation. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce our amazing speakers, Dr. Dina Afrianty. Firstly, an absolutely trailblazing scholar, in my opinion, with respect to women's rights and disability in Indonesia and Muslim societies more broadly. Dina's a research fellow at La Trobe currently. She's also speaking tonight as the founder and the president of the Australia-Indonesia Disability Research and Advocacy Network, we'll call AIDRAN for simplicity. Beau Newham is the co-founder of Queer Indonesia Archive, which is a community-focused and volunteer-run digital archiving project, which aims to collect, preserve, and celebrate material reflecting the lives and experiences of queer Indonesia. And Beau's worked in the LGBTIQ+ activism space in Indonesia for the last 5 years, so an extremely experienced and passionate advocate joining us tonight. And Dr. Annisa is a lecturer in Cultural Studies at the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. Her research interests are very broad, and they include youth, media, decolonization, political subjectivity in Indonesia and broader Southeast Asia. And before coming to Melbourne, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the National University of Singapore. So now that we all know one another, we're going to jump into some questions, and we're going to start by defining which intersectional perspectives we're speaking from tonight. Again, if you have any questions, let us know, but we'll start with Annisa. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work and define for those who aren't familiar with the terms what you mean when you're talking about gender and decolonization, particularly in terms of their intersectionality?
Thanks so much, Balawyn. And before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm beaming to you right now from the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So that's a very important question, and I think a question that I need to revisit often to really actually understand what I'm doing. So when I'm talking about gender and decolonization, and in relation perhaps to the idea of intersectionality, I'm looking at gender as a way to perform, well, not in a performative sense, but sort of to repeat some acts of stylization of your body. That's, of course, a famous Judith Butlerian definition of gender. And it's about repeating certain performances to become a certain member of a gender. Usually it's the cisgender, right? So for me, in my research, I focus on how young women do acts and maybe modify their behaviors to become a woman, or to imagine, to do ways that they can think of themselves as part of this group called young women, or perempuan muda in Indonesia. And I think it's really related to decolonization, and the term of decolonization, I think, has been quite popular these days, but I have to underline that it has very different meanings when we understand it from the settler colonial perspective, like in Australia or Canada or United States, because it's very important to point out that in these contexts, decolonization is not and should not ever be considered as a metaphor, right? So scholars like Iftak has highlighted the point that decolonization should never be a metaphor, but it should be about returning the sovereignty to the First Nations, to the indigenous people. So that's the one perspective of looking at decolonization. But when we talk about post-colonial states like Indonesia, the context that we're talking about, and many others in Asia, decolonization should really be about our attempt and ongoing process to rethink and work out our historical relation and social relation, the products of it, with our former colonizer. And it could take forms culturally, politically, economically, and in many other forms. And I think when we imagine colonizers, especially for Indonesians, we often think, oh, Belanda, dulu dijajah oleh Belanda. It seems like it's all in the past. But it's really also important to remember that the effects of colonization is still ongoing. And we also have different forms of neo-colonial thoughts or neo-imperialism, especially from the American influences. So when we talk about gender and decolonization, and perhaps we can later talk about intersectionality, it's about how we're looking at young women, for instance, or women in general, and to understand what types of oppressions or different domains of oppressions that young women and women are located in. So these types of oppressions, be it race-based, ethnicity-based, class-based, disability, abled bodies, and so on, could be informed by, are actually products of colonization and colonizer logics or neo-imperialist logics. And I suppose it's an ongoing work that needs to be done to make that link between what has happened in the past and how the effects of colonization continues to influence the way we think about how we should be and what we should be in the future. And by we, I'm talking about Indonesians and young women specifically.
I'm on mute. Thank you, Annisa. I think something that's really interesting coming out of those definitions is how much of this is an ongoing process. So decolonization is not historical, it's always ongoing, and it's something we need to reflect on, particularly in the bilateral relationship between Australia and Indonesia. And also gender is something that's not set, but is also ongoing in terms of performing our gender. And maybe Dina can speak more on this, but there's this distinction between sex and gender being performed, how we act as women or men, and how that relates to Islam or religious notions of kodrat. So what can we change? What can we not change? How does society view us, depending on how we behave and the symbolism we adopt through our actions? So moving on to Dina, could you tell us a little bit more about your work and how you define gender and how this relates intersectionally with the concept of disability?
Thanks, Winnie. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, of the Wurundjeri people, and I would like to pay respect to the elders, past and present. That's a very interesting introductions provided by Annisa, and the way I use intersectionality in my work, I work on gender, Islam, and politics in Indonesia, but most recently I've also developed my research around disability. And it is very interesting because as some of you probably have aware of, that when talking about disability, we cannot separate it from the how race, how religion, how gender, and how social class have its impact on the status and well-being of people with disabilities. It is not just in Indonesia, but everywhere else in the world, both in the global south and also in the global north. And some of them is because of how the status of people with disability is affected by the policies. And if we all understand, policies are made as a result of the contestations of, of many and various factors at hand. And so when talking about inclusion, when talking about advocating the rights of people with disabilities, we've always looked at how social class, for example, and also how religion and cultural values have its impact on how society perceive disabilities. And this is very important because one of the major obstacles and one of the major issues that have challenged people with disabilities in Indonesia is the perceptions around disabilities. And this also has something to do with the way the state, for example, introduced and created its policy towards people with disabilities. During the New Order, it's very much inspired and influenced by the medical model, where disability is seen as an impairment, and that impairment is the problem, and because it's a problem, it needs to be fixed. When this kind of notions that it needs to be fixed is there, then the society will always think you need to fix yourself first, and that created the perceptions that as a society we don't have, or we are not contributing to the issues and challenges faced by people with disabilities. And so in my advocacy and also in my research, we've always tried to look at how we address that first, because without addressing the way society perceives disability, then the way we can help improve the environment, because the problem is with the environment, and that environment is a space where every single factors contribute to create that barriers in the environment. And so intersectionality really helps disability advocates and people like me, who are the allies of disability advocates, to work around changing society attitudes. And like in gender, we have Indonesia is a country probably in the world with so many policies have been created to improve the status of women, and also the same thing with the status of people with disabilities. But the problem has always been how gender norms have been the major obstacles for government, for policymakers, and also policy implementers to make sure that this policy can benefit the targeted constituent, which is women. And the same thing with people with disabilities. That is the problem, the disability norms that have been the major obstacles also for the government to implement the policies that they have been introduced in the past 10 years. And so intersectionality should help us understand it better. And I think with participants at this webinar, you come from all different social class, all different, the type of employment that you are working with. They are all contributing to how we can make sure that as part of the society, we can promote the rights of and fulfill the rights of people with disabilities.
Thank you so much, Dina. I think a few things that are so important to reflect on are how we have internalized those norms and those stereotypes about disability or about gender and so on, and the relationship between not only government policy and history and how that informs our perceptions, but our relationship with ourselves and our own thoughts, and reflecting on our understandings and our biases, and moving forward to be not only better advocates for these causes, but also better allies to causes that are not our own. So I think understanding how to be better allies is hopefully something we can get out of this, because no one knows everything about everything. When we're talking about intersectionality, everyone has blind spots. And so it's amazing for us to come together and reflect on where we intersect and where we still have learning to do. And just moving on to Beau, something that Dina also touched on, which is really topical, is how history informs contemporary understandings. And I understand that QIA's work looks into the past in order not only to preserve knowledge, but also to learn and understand today's world. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work and how you define queerness in QIA's work, and how that relates to other concepts intersectionally, such as gender or decolonization?
Okay, there we go. Hello, everyone. My name's Beau. Thank you, Winnie, and thank you so much, Dr. Dina and Dr. Annisa. That's really enjoyed listening to those explanations. I would first want to start by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation. So I am traveling at the moment. So it is very nice for me to be a guest on new land here in Sydney. And I want to pay respect to the traditional custodians of the land that I'm currently on, and pay respects to elders both past, present, and emerging. I also want to send my respect to the Indigenous peoples across the archipelago of Indonesia that QIA does the majority of its work on, and give my solidarity to their ongoing struggle for land rights and autonomy. So to go back to your question, Winnie, QIA uses queer as a broad and inclusive umbrella term that indicates our interest in objects that reflect the experience of sexualities, genders, and gender expressions that are deemed non-normative by current dominant cis and heteronormative discourses in Indonesia. Of course, this term doesn't adequately capture either the gender or sexual diversity that exists across Indonesia, nor the role that this diversity has played in the numerous cultures across the archipelago. We hope that the archive supports further exploration and interrogation of the use of both queer and other terms under the LGBTIQ acronym as terminology for the Sogi SC communities within Indonesia, and allow some insight into the creative and expansive use of language and identity markers that has occurred throughout the communities of Indonesia and throughout especially the last 100 years. In terms of intersectionality, the archive is committed to building a framework that emphasizes how notions of gender and sexuality are always connected to structures like capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, religion, race, heteropatriarchy, ability, and the nation state. The archive sees that it's these structures that frame who and what, the who, the what, and the how of what is remembered, what is preserved, and what is celebrated in our memory institutions. Since this is a very new project, it started at the beginning of 2020, at the moment, in terms of collecting material, we are prioritizing what we have deemed vulnerable content. And we're especially focused on communities and histories that have been largely ignored by either memory institutions such as libraries, museums, or academia and learning institutions such as universities. However, of course, this is a very difficult task, and it often requires a lot of legwork by our volunteers to engage with community members and build up the trust and relationships needed for them to want to share their materials and their stories with a new institution such as a community archive. So beyond prioritizing the contributions of marginalized communities or communities that may not have been focused on by memory institutions, we also have a growing oral history project that's aiming to take life histories of community members into the future. Within these interviews, we've highlighted the importance of emphasizing the interconnections of social issues when developing questions and topics to focus on, as we feel it's important to invite participants to share their wider experiences and acknowledge them as authorities, not only on their own identities and their own bodies, but also on the wider social and historical issues that have occurred over their lifetimes. So often, especially in queer work, but especially in queer work and especially when talking to or engaging with non-cis participants, it's often they're very much only drawn upon to give their expertise and their knowledge and opinions on their own bodies and their sexualities, rather than kind of seeing them as these fully fleshed people that have, you know, multifaceted and have been taken part in every aspect of the culture around them. So to go back to your original point in terms of history, of course, in our work, not only do we have to consider the identities and intersections that are occurring in our communities as we speak now, but as we are collecting materials that go back over the last 100 years, we also have to consider different forms of identities, different uses of language, and different kind of gender forms and political forms that may not necessarily have an easy flow or an easy connection to the way that current community members think, feel, and organize around gender and sexuality today. So that's kind of an intersection that both has to happen in the contemporary, but also in thinking about how do materials that speak to historical gender and sexuality forms interrelate with the communities that will be associated with them in the contemporary day and age. So it's a lot of our intersectionality work is about ensuring that we're both respecting communities that existed in the past, but also respecting and working with the communities that are interrelated with those identities in the contemporary.
Thank you so much, Beau. I can't believe that QIA was only founded this year, because I've already heard so much about your work as an organization. You've achieved so much already. And I guess that goes to show, although there's long histories of advocacy either in the disability or women's movements or queer communities, there is always space for room for youth and young people to start new initiatives and contribute to these legacies. So that's super exciting, and I'm sure a lot of people here will be interested in looking up QIA and learning more about the project. I think your point about taking a structural point of view is so important, because nothing exists in isolation. Everything is interconnected, which is at the core of this concept of intersectionality. But another thing is, who tells the narrative? And so when we're looking at history in particular, whether it's women or people with disability or queer communities, these perspectives are marginalized or silenced. And that's very well known. We don't have the documents. We don't have their stories most of the time, because they didn't have the power, weren't in those positions of power to have their voices heard. And so I just think that the archiving project is particularly important as we're moving through generations, so we don't lose that knowledge and lose those perspectives. Speaking of communities that have been historically marginalized, I just wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on how your work specifically seeks to empower people. So specifically seeks to power groups or communities. Could you give an example from your work or your organization's work about how it aims to empower people? And what I mean by that is, we're trying to give space to people. We're trying to give them platforms and amplify their voices and perspectives. So when we talk about empowerment, what tangible kind of initiatives are you or your organizations working on at the moment? Maybe starting with Dina.
Yeah, I think we must all understand that at the very heart of intersectionality is oppression. And when we are talking about gender, people with disabilities, and queer, it's, I think, the oppressions that comes from all different forms, from policies, from structure, from society. And so when we are talking about intersectionality, then we need to talk about the impact of discriminations. And this can only be experienced by women, by the queer, and by people with disabilities. And addressing that oppressions and various forms of discriminations is by letting the voices and letting those experiences to be out there, to be expressed openly, to be heard, and to be understood. And so that's why in our work with AIDRAN, for example, one of the key aim that we have is to make AIDRAN, to create AIDRAN as a platform where the voices, the experience of people with disabilities can be out there. And I think in Indonesia, as a result of seclusion, and also because disability has always been invisible, they are not there in public. So people don't understand about people with disabilities needs, different needs. People don't get to try to fulfill what is the needs of people with disabilities. And that's all because of that seclusion, because they have never been out there in public space. And so what we do in terms of advocating the rights of people with disabilities is to work with people with disabilities. And even at AIDRAN, I don't have disability, but Indonesian chair of AIDRAN is someone with lived experience. And also our researchers are mostly people with lived experience. And that's the idea, is to give that platform, and then for people with lived experience to be able to voice and to share their experience with the public. And through our website, our social media, the idea is really to make that public space more robust. And so the stories of how parents who have children with disabilities, people with disabilities, students with disabilities, engage in the community, and the daily discriminations that they face in their everyday life can be documented through stories, through, luckily now we have, all the social media platform, Instagram and YouTube, and where we can record and document, like what Beau said with the queer project thing, the same, that's also the idea that we would like AIDRAN to be able to play and contribute in that space. And so hopefully then the more people talk about disability, the more people learn about the experiences that people with disability have to face in their daily lives, the more people understand. And this understanding is very important in addressing the oppressions and also the discriminations. And then social transformation can eventually be achieved.
Thank you so much, Dina. That's a really interesting point that you bring up with respect to lived experience, because as some of you know, Dina and I have both worked in the area of domestic violence in Indonesia. And as you said, it's about, as an ally, using your privilege to create and support platforms where people with lived experiences can share their voices. And importantly, as Beau raised, not only on that specific part of their identity, but as people with all different facets and experiences, and being able to share that in a really full and rich way. Beau, would you be able to elaborate QIA's work and how it seeks to empower, or as Dina mentioned, what the relationship is between disempowerment and empowerment in terms of QIA's work?
There we are. So I guess to begin, I would just give maybe just a little background on what QAA actually is and how it functions. So as I said before, QAA is a digital archiving project that started in the beginning of 2020. And the goal initially was about collecting materials from existing organizations in Indonesia. But since then, it has grown to a much wider project on focusing on collecting any materials that reflect the experiences of queer Indonesia, with a goal of collection, preservation, and celebration. Although we have only started this year, we currently have a collection of about 2,000 objects, and that mostly consists of gay, lesbian, and trans magazines from the early 80s until the mid 2000s, or the mid noughties, I should say. Photos, newspaper clippings, digital archives of websites from the early 2000s and blogs. And one of our most recent and now our biggest contribution was the entirety of a community forum that was active from 2004 until 2 days ago. So we're able to digitally archive that entire experience. So the project is volunteer run. So when I say that, I mean every single person involved in it is a volunteer. We have about 80 active volunteers that help us with cataloging, collecting, describing our materials. And the ultimate aim is to just have a giant digital repository that is accessible, functional, and hopefully exciting. It's a huge project, and so we know that for it to be sustainable, that it really has to be about building a community around the archive and empowering those that are part of that community to, you know, to take on and eventually, you know, we hope to build a membership-based organization that will be able to bring this project into the future. Because Indonesia is facing a time when the lived experiences and narratives of queer peoples are being challenged to race and delegitimized in the national collective memory, especially over the last 20 years. And this project was to kind of focus on two big concerns. One is that there's many stories, people, organization, and movements that are highly vulnerable to being forgotten or erased through the loss of their material history. And then more slowly, and the community memory and history of those movements also as people get older. And secondly, we felt that over the last 20 years that kind of this very active goal of erasure of this history had cut off new generations from being able to access the history of the movement and of the communities that they're a part of. You know, it's for a younger queer person in Indonesia, it is quite difficult to get access to the history of the movement, especially in language. And the materials that do exist is obviously highly focused on the gay men's movement and to a lesser extent the lesbian movement. And you know, although trans porn groups have been, you know, the most organized, they were organized the earliest, have been the most active, they have the largest spread of organizations across the archipelago and have been working over a much longer period of history. There's some of that movement is some of the least documented, so it is quite vulnerable. So we hope that by giving people access to primary sources of materials, so you know, materials that were made in the time by members of the community themselves, that we can help build a new generation of queer community members that can access this history and start, you know, building creative projects, doing their own research based on their own access to these materials rather than always having to go through Western learning institutions or accessing the materials via Western scholars. Because even though there are some libraries that have amazing collections of these materials, they are quite often not in Indonesia, and that people do need, access to, libraries in Australia, libraries in the Netherlands in order to even get access to these, materials that were made in Indonesia by queer Indonesians. And so that we hope that by providing this access, making these materials easily searchable, and helping people see how they relate to the materials, we're able to empower the communities to kind of reinterpret these histories on their own terms, and hopefully limit as much as possible the role of intermediaries in that process. We want to try and get contemporary queer communities as close as possible to these materials. And then, just lastly, I'll just touch on it briefly because I mentioned it earlier, our Oral Histories project, which will be focusing on older members of the community. We hope that by, by recording these life histories and allowing them to speak on their own terms on issues that matter to them, that we also kind of are letting them set the agenda instead of kind of, it's so easy to kind of always be influenced by, what's going on in the US or what's going on in the Western world in terms of like, what are the queer priorities? What are the political priorities of these communities, instead of kind of, giving space for grassroots communities to actually set the agenda themselves. Because especially with funding models how they are, and the way that funding flows to community groups, it's often, Western donors that are always setting the agenda on what gets spoken about and what gets prioritized.
100%, Beau. Thank you so much. A mammoth project. And what you just touched upon really relates to Annisa's work when we're talking about aid and decolonization. And so someone asked, can we address how intersectionality and the discourses around intersectionality in Australia can be used in Indonesia and vice versa? So this is a question that's talking about that bilateral space. What I thought Annisa would speak on is, yes, for instance, Dina's project has funding from Australia, and that is fantastic. Yes, Beau is working with Indonesian advocates, and you have a collaborative and respectful relationship where you are uplifting one another. But it's not always that way. Those AIDRAN and QIA are examples of how to do it in terms of respectful collaborative relationships. But there are some problematic elements in the bilateral relationship when it comes to intersectionality and colonial or decolonial perspectives. Annisa, could you talk about your experiences and your research in the aid sector and the funding sector in the bilateral space and lessons learned?
Thanks so much, Balawyn. I just have to say first that I'm very grateful that I'm in this panel, because it's so amazing to hear what Dr. Dina is doing and what Beau is doing, because it's very inspiring. And to just riff off from both of your points on considering different identity, gender, sexuality, political forms for the queers in Indonesia, as well as the issue of visibility and invisibility of the disabled in Indonesia as well. And to return back to Balawyn's question, it's really important how we have to point out first that there are blind spots. And I have to say that we have to admit that there are blind spots, and to admit it that way is not to blame one party and think that the other party would give solution, because I don't think that will be productive. And I've seen that happen many times, right? When we expect one to be the troublemaker and the other to solve the problem. So in the current research that I'm doing with a very important research I'm doing with, I'm grateful to have access to Rian Febrianto, who is an advocate and activist for youth and children's rights. We've looked into a couple of things, but mainly maybe that what I can share, we published about how the discourse of child marriage has been framed by many NGOs and, of course, well-meaning international organizations to minimize child marriage among girls and young women in Indonesia. And although the problem, I'm not trying to say that it's an ambiguous problem, it's not, it's a problem. But the thing is that often, and it's related to decolonization, often people who receive aid, the beneficiaries, are often depicted a certain way that makes them seem to always be vulnerable and always to have very little sense of agency. And in our paper, we saw that sometimes certain groups of people with certain skin color are depicted to be problems. So these are very important when we think about how we represent certain group of people as the problematic ones, right? And that's one element of it. The other element of it is that if we want to do, or if we want to use the decolonial framework, perhaps we can get away from the victim versus heroes model, and also to get away from the success versus failure model. And I've heard this a lot. I don't work in advocacy, but this is a part of my academic work. So what I'm interested in is to shift the epistemological framework of the subjectivity of people who receive the benefits. And I heard the most important point made by Margianta, who's also a youth activist like Rian, who felt like his work became meaningless often when people demanded that the young people and the children that they work with to be good children or to be the ideal youth subjects in order to receive helps or benefits. And I think when we can reimagine the possible ways of decolonizing bilateral relation, we need to think about, of course, practical ways, but also to seek bigger picture conversation and not to repeat the same problem. So I want to be practical, and this is my first attempt to be practical. I think first it's important to make sure that intersectionality or intersectional issues are not treated as checklist. And scholar Jasbir Puar mentioned this very importantly, especially for, of course, Bono, for queers, not to use their identity, not to use the forms of expressions that they show to us as a way to sort of, to fulfill a certain list that we prefer when we give help or when we want to do intervention, or to even be in conversation with them. And hopefully it will never be treated as such. And then other than that, I think that it's important as well that the pressure that we, and by we, I mean people who work in advocacy, often receive in funding and in reporting could be lifted in some ways. And I know it's impossible. Some people here will just be laughing about that. But I guess so that we don't repeat the same problem. Because the documents that Rian and I analyzed on child marriage were actually recent documents. They were published in 2020, 2017, 2018. And despite the important books on post-developmentalist project, all of this pluralist perspective that a lot of scholars have encouraged, we still see the same problem being repeated. So I think it's important, and I'm sure the conversation here will be very fruitful in rethinking how we can think of intersectionality and decoloniality.
Thank you so much, Annisa. And I think that when you work in this field for a long time, you start to realize, well, none of these problems are new, and none of the discriminatory rhetoric is new or unique. Men think they're funny, they're not. If you're a homophobe, you're not original. So there is this kind of cyclical pattern where we're seeing the same problems again and again. And we're just trying not to make the same mistakes. We're trying to do better than we did last time. And I also think something that's important to remember, someone said, what's best practice? This is a question in terms of intersectionality and how to be inclusive. And I think something that's important, and this is my opinion, is that we should acknowledge that we all have blind spots, that we're learning together, and we should acknowledge where the knowledge lies, because we don't have all of the knowledge. There are communities that exist that have this knowledge. And so that, what you were saying, Annisa, also comes up in my work a lot. Women, particularly Muslim women, I work a lot in Aceh, they're always stereotyped in terms of aid as being victims. And if you actually look into it, there is a wealth of knowledge and resources and women's advocates advocating for themselves within and outside of Islamic frameworks. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We're not coming up with the answers on the fly or by ourselves. We have to acknowledge where this knowledge already exists. So just to open the floor to any of you, what would your advice be in terms of best practice? What have you found helpful in terms of applying intersectionality in a real way and not just in a checklist kind of way in your work?
Maybe I can start with that, Winnie. That's very interesting. I think the point that were recently raised. I think in both of my work on gender and also on people with disabilities, I'm very familiar with these ideas of post-coloniality and also how we need to be very careful, and the theme and subject about agency. But I think I've always come to these reflections when we talk about identity, we talk about knowledge, right? And so when we are talking about knowledge, this comes from the conversations, the interactions, exposure of an individual with their environment. And for example, in the case of Aceh with women, yes, for example, that there is often depiction that women are victims. In my book, which Winnie, I'm sure, have already read it, that women are not the victim. Sorry, that women, yes, I would say they are the victims of the system, of the structure, but women were able to find their agency because you know, there is space that allows them to use that space to voice their experience, to voice the different oppressions, discriminations that they have. And that ideas or the voices that they made about the oppressions is because of that knowledge that they get from interacting with their environment. In that case, for example, it was during the post-tsunami that, you know, all the Indonesians, nationals, NGOs, and also international NGOs were flocked in Aceh, in Banda Aceh, and with all the seminars, with everywhere, people organizing workshops. You know, you can see banners everywhere in the corner of Banda Aceh about gender equality, and people all start talking about it. People start wondering, what is it? They may not be agree at all with the idea of gender equality, but I think individuals have that ability to internalize the norms and values, and they were able to sort of like filtering it, which they think is acceptable for them as an individual and as a group. And so the same thing also with the issues around the rights of people with disabilities. We have the universal principles of UNCR, that is UNCRPD. Same thing with gender equality, CEDAW, and also with the children. Also, there's a convention, and that convention is really is really the platform for everyone to start talking about, you know, about creating knowledge. And I think we have to be very careful as well by not just saying that we have to be mindful of, of the ideas or your culture being dominated by other culture. But I think in every rights movement, it's going to be there. The discourse, the debate, and the discussion will always be there. But I guess we need to always be thoughtful that individual has the capacity to filter the values that they think is appropriate for them, with their identity, being a Muslim, being Acehnese, being people with disabilities, being Chinese Indonesians, being West Sumatrans, for example. And I think I must say that in terms of women's movement, for example, Indonesia's women's movement have already demonstrated that capacity. Women's organizations across Indonesia have that kind of ability. They work with donors, but they were like able to say, no, we are not. Yes, we are going to do that, but we are doing it in our own way. And that's because of the ability and because of the space that they have. And the idea that we have with AIDRAN is also to make sure that we are not going to put our own agenda, but we only want to create that space, and that space, that platform, we are, hopefully that will be, because it's also very we need to be very careful as well. We don't want to be seen as a practicing ableism, right? So we need to be very mindful of that as well. But probably to wrap up, I'm just going to say how grateful I am to be given the opportunity by CAUSINDY, because this is exactly the opportunity that we would like to have. That, I don't know how many of you have been, having the exposure to learn about the various discriminations of people with disabilities. And so hopefully after this webinar, you have become more aware of the rights of people with disabilities, and you start looking at your surroundings in your offices, for example, whether your employer has already employed people with disability, because that's exactly what the UNCRPD that Indonesia has ratified, and also the national legislation have said. And that's, again, that's the international platform. And I think one way of, contributing to that is by doing exactly that. So yeah. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Dina. No, that was amazing. And I think you've indirectly answered the last question we had, is, are we optimistic or pessimistic about the political climate in Australia, and I think by extension Indonesia or Australia, with respect to gender, queer rights and decolonisation? There is always work to do, but there is always work being done. And so I've found that, yes, you can get burnout, you can get compassion fatigue, you can get all of these different things where you think, I'm tired, and we're saying the same things over and over again, but you are creating space and we are making progress and things are getting better. And then sometimes they get a little bit worse, but then they'll get better again. And so I think you can't be all or the other. We're not always optimistic, we're not always pessimistic, we're a healthy mix of both. And I just wanted to say, we have been incredibly ambitious in this panel. I'm very proud of all of us. Of course, this does not begin to encapsulate all of the other intersectional perspectives that you could possibly bring up. We've touched on race, we've touched on class, we've touched on politics and religion and age, and it's limitless in terms of where these discussions can go. And I hope that we'll have opportunities to have more conversations like this in 2021, even in person, inshallah. But I wanted to say thank you so much to Beau, Annisa and Dina for your time and for such a lovely conversation to round out 2020, really a highlight. And if anyone would like to ask any follow-up questions, I'm sure you can all find Beau, Annisa and Dina online through their various organizations and continue to have these conversations. So thank you, everyone. And I think someone just said, thank you, CAUSINDY, and thank you, AIDRAN, thank you, QIA, thank you, University of Melbourne, La Trobe, for lending us your scholars. And this will be recorded and it will be put up on Facebook. And so if anyone missed it and you think that they might benefit from being a part of this conversation, please let them know that they can be a part of the conversation by going to CAUSINDY's Facebook. Terima kasih semua. Assalamualaikum and sampai jumpa.